No one in the room expected the hearing to unfold the way it did. What began as a routine line of questioning suddenly turned into one of the most talked about moments of the day. A senator appeared ready to corner former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi with a series of pointed accusations. The tone suggested the questions were meant to trap her. But within minutes, the situation flipped completely. Instead of backing down, Bondi calmly turned the exchange around, and the moment quickly became something no one in the hearing room could ignore. By the end of it, the senator who thought he had the upper hand found himself facing a very different outcome than he expected. Here's exactly what happened. The hearing room looked like many others on Capitol Hill, quiet on the surface, but filled with a sense of anticipation that seemed to hang in the air. Long wooden desks stretched across the front of the chamber in a wide arc. Lawmakers sat behind them in high-backed chairs, each surrounded by neatly organized stacks of documents, folders, and tablets glowing softly under the bright overhead lights. Staff members moved carefully behind the scenes, occasionally leaning in to pass a note or whisper a quick reminder. The room itself carried a formal atmosphere, one that comes with government hearings where every word spoken can quickly become part of the public record. Behind the lawmakers, rows of chairs had been filled by reporters, camera operators, and a handful of observers who had come to watch the proceedings unfold. Some reporters sat with laptops open, their fingers hovering over the keyboards, ready to capture anything that might turn into a headline. Others held small recorders or adjusted their cameras, quietly scanning the room. For the most part, however, the environment remained calm and orderly. At the center of the room, facing the lawmakers, sat the witness table. And seated at that table was Pam Bondi. Bondi carried herself with the composure of someone who had spent years in high-profile public roles. During her time as Florida's Attorney General, she had faced tough interviews, press conferences, and courtroom arguments. Public scrutiny was not something new to her. Hearings like this were simply another part of that world. She sat upright, hands resting near a stack of papers placed neatly in front of her. Occasionally, she glanced down at her notes or took a sip of water as different lawmakers took their turns asking questions. From a distance, the scene looked almost routine. The first portion of the hearing unfolded exactly the way many hearings do. One by one, lawmakers spoke into their microphones, asking questions about past legal decisions, policies, and actions taken during Bondi's time in office. Some questions were straightforward, requests for clarification. Others touched on more complex legal issues. Bondi responded carefully. She rarely rushed her answers. Instead, she often paused briefly before speaking, choosing her words with precision. Her tone remained steady, and her responses reflected the kind of careful language common in legal settings. In moments like these, every sentence matters. A single phrase can be quoted, interpreted, or debated long after the hearing ends, so Bondi appeared focused on providing answers that were clear, but measured. As the hearing continued, the rhythm of the room settled into a predictable pattern. A lawmaker would ask a question. Bondi would respond. Another lawmaker would follow. With a different topic, the exchange moved forward, methodically. Occasionally, a staff member would slide a new document toward one of the lawmakers, or a quiet murmur would pass through the back rows as reporters compared notes. But overall, nothing about the hearing suggested that it would soon become memorable. Many hearings proceed this way from beginning to end. They are important for the public record, but rarely dramatic. Even some reporters in the back rows appeared relaxed, glancing occasionally at their phones or reviewing earlier notes while waiting for something that might stand out. And then, about halfway through the session, something shifted. One senator leaned forward toward his microphone. The movement was subtle at first, but it drew the attention of people nearby. Staff members looked up from their notes, and several reporters straightened in their seats. The senator adjusted a folder in front of him and cleared his throat slightly before beginning to speak. At first, his voice carried the same formal tone that had filled the room all morning, but as he continued, people began to notice a difference. Instead of asking a short, direct question like the lawmakers before him, the senator began laying out a series of statements. One after another, he described events from Bondi's time in office. He referenced decisions that had been made years earlier and pointed to documents as he spoke. The way he presented the information seemed deliberate. Rather than moving quickly to a question, he took time building his explanation. Each sentence added another layer to the narrative he appeared to be constructing. Reporters in the back rows immediately noticed the shift. Several of them leaned closer to their laptops. Moments like this often signal that a hearing might be about to produce a headline. Camera operators slowly adjusted their angles, making sure the witness table and the senator were both clearly in frame. Even people sitting quietly along the sidewalls could sense that the tone of the hearing had changed. The calm, predictable rhythm from earlier in the session was fading. In its place, a new tension began to fill the room. Bondi listened without interrupting. From her seat at the witness table, she kept her posture steady and her expression composed. Occasionally she glanced down at her notes, but most of the time her attention remained fixed on the senator speaking. The statements continued for several minutes. By the time the senator finally reached his question, the atmosphere inside the chamber felt noticeably different from earlier in the day. The room had grown quiet. Even the soft tapping of reporters' keyboards had slowed. All eyes were now focused on the witness table, because whatever happened next would likely shape the most memorable moment of the entire hearing. Instead of asking a simple, straightforward question, the senator began by laying out a long series of statements. One after another, he carefully read from his notes, building a detailed setup before even getting to the question itself. Each statement seemed deliberately crafted to cast Bondi's past decisions in a negative light. He spoke with confidence, occasionally flipping through documents placed neatly in front of him on the desk. Every few seconds, he would pause just long enough to emphasize a key point before moving on to the next line. The pattern was clear. This wasn't just background information. It was a carefully constructed narrative. With each statement, the senator appeared to be guiding the audience toward a specific conclusion: that Bondi's actions during her time in office had been questionable. People sitting in the hearing room quickly sensed what was happening. Some of the lawmakers, listening quietly, exchanged glances. Staff members behind them leaned slightly forward, trying not to miss a word. In the back rows, reporters began typing faster on their laptops. Moments like this often signal that something important might be unfolding. Political hearings can sometimes move slowly, filled with technical questions and routine answers. But when a lawmaker spends several minutes setting up a question like this, it usually means they are preparing for a moment of confrontation. The senator continued speaking. He referenced past decisions, public statements, and interpretations of events that had taken place years earlier. Each example seemed designed to strengthen the same central idea. By the time he reached the end of his long setup, the tone in the room had noticeably shifted. What had started as a typical line of questioning now felt much more intense. Everyone understood that the real question was coming next. Finally, after several minutes, the senator paused. He looked down at his notes one more time. Then he asked his question. But even then, the wording didn't sound like a normal question. It sounded more like a challenge. Instead of inviting a simple explanation, the phrasing seemed to push Bondi into a corner. It left very little room for a short or neutral response. The implication behind the question was unmistakable. For a brief moment, the entire room fell silent. No one spoke. No papers shuffled. Even the quiet clicking of keyboards seemed to pause. All eyes turned toward the witness table. Pam Bondi sat calmly in her chair, listening carefully as the senator finished speaking. People watching closely were waiting to see how she would respond. In situations like this, many witnesses choose the safest option. They give brief answers. They avoid confrontation. Sometimes they even redirect the conversation entirely. Several people in the room appeared to expect exactly that. From the perspective of the senator's strategy, that outcome would have been ideal. If Bondi gave a short or defensive answer, the narrative he had just built would remain largely unchallenged. But Bondi didn't respond right away. Instead, she paused for a moment. She adjusted the microphone slightly and glanced down at the documents in front of her. It wasn't a nervous gesture. It looked more like someone taking a second to organize their thoughts. That brief pause only made the moment feel more dramatic. Reporters in the room leaned forward. Camera operators adjusted their focus toward the witness table. Even people who had been quietly observing earlier now seemed fully engaged. Then Bondi finally began to speak. Her tone was calm and steady. She didn't rush her answer. Instead of reacting emotionally to the long list of accusations implied in the senator's statements, she addressed the situation carefully. The first thing she did was challenge the premise of the setup itself. According to Bondi, the description of events the senator had just presented left out important context. She explained that many of the decisions being referenced had been made under specific legal circumstances. Those circumstances, she said, were essential to understanding why those choices were made. Without that context, the situation could easily appear misleading. As she continued speaking, it became clear that she wasn't going to limit herself to a short reply. Rather than simply defending one decision, she began addressing the broader narrative. the senator had tried to build. She pointed out that public officials often face criticism when complex legal decisions are reduced to brief summaries. In many cases, she explained, those decisions involve layers of information, legal obligations, and time-sensitive judgments. Removing those details can dramatically change how the situation appears. Her response remained measured throughout. She didn't raise her voice or show visible frustration, but there was a firmness in her tone that made it clear she strongly disagreed with the way the issue had been framed. By this point, the atmosphere in the hearing room had completely shifted. What began as a carefully constructed challenge from the senator had turned into something much more dynamic. Instead of quietly absorbing the criticism, Bondi was actively pushing back, and people in the room could tell that the exchange was no longer going to follow the simple script that had been expected. Just moments earlier, reporters typed quickly again, capturing every word, because moments like this, when a tense setup suddenly turns into a direct and unexpected response, are exactly the kind of exchanges that define a hearing long after it ends. When Bondi began speaking, her tone was calm but firm. Instead of rushing to defend herself, she first addressed the way the question had been framed. Rather than reacting emotionally, she paused for a brief moment and then carefully explained that the SHR's description of the situation left out several important details and pieces of context. According to Bondi, decisions made by a state attorney general are rarely as simple as they might appear when they are summarized in just a few sentences during a hearing. Legal decisions, she explained, are almost never based on a single factor. They require evaluating evidence, understanding legal precedent, and considering the boundaries set by the law itself. Every action taken by an attorney general must fall within those limits, even when political pressure or public expectations push in different directions. As she continued speaking, Bondi began walking through the events the senator had referenced. Step by step, she explained the reasoning behind those decisions. She spoke slowly and clearly, outlining the timeline and describing what information had been available to her office at the time. Rather than simply rejecting the senator's claims, she focused on providing the missing context that she believed had been overlooked in many ways. Her approach was methodical. First, she addressed the legal framework surrounding the decision. Then she explained how her office evaluated the available evidence. Finally, she described why the final decision had been made the way it was. Throughout the explanation, Bondi never raised her voice. She didn't interrupt the senator or show signs of frustration. Instead, she maintained the same steady tone, almost as if she were presenting a legal argument in a courtroom rather than responding to a tense exchange during a congressional hearing. That composure did not go unnoticed. The room, which had been tense only moments earlier, began to feel different. Some lawmakers who had been watching the exchange closely started glancing down at their notes. Others shifted slightly in their chairs as they listened. Reporters sitting toward the back of the hearing room continued typing quickly on their laptops, capturing every word of the exchange. For them, moments like this were exactly why hearings often draw such attention. A single question can suddenly turn into a defining moment when the response changes the direction of the conversation. Bondi continued explaining the process behind the decision, emphasizing that public officials often face criticism for actions that appear simple when viewed from the outside. But inside government offices, she said, those same decisions usually involve long discussions, legal reviews, and careful consideration of the law. She reminded the committee that attorneys general are bound by legal standards that cannot simply be ignored for political convenience. Even if the public or lawmakers might prefer a different outcome, the responsibility of the office is to follow the law as it is written. As Bondi spoke, it became clear that she was not simply answering the senator's question. She was also reframing the entire discussion. Instead of focusing on the accusation implied in the senator's remarks, she shifted attention toward the complexity of legal decision-making. By the time she reached the final part of her explanation, the room had grown noticeably quieter. The earlier tension had not completely disappeared, but it had changed form. The exchange no longer felt like a confrontation. Instead, it felt more like a detailed explanation of how government decisions actually unfold behind the scenes. Some lawmakers leaned forward slightly, listening closely as Bondi finished outlining her reasoning. Others remained still, watching the exchange play out. The senator who had asked the question waited for her to finish, perhaps expecting a shorter or more defensive answer. Instead, Bondi had delivered a structured explanation that walked through the issue, piece by piece. What had started as a pointed attempt to challenge her record was beginning to sound very different. rather than appearing trapped by the question. Bondi had used the moment to expand on the realities of the job she once held by calmly addressing each point and providing additional context. She had turned the exchange into something closer to a legal clarification than a political confrontation. And in hearings like this, those moments can often shift the entire atmosphere in the room. For observers watching the exchange unfold, it was becoming clear that the attempt to corner Bondi had not unfolded the way some might have expected. Instead of stumbling under pressure, she had responded with the same measured approach that had defined much of her career in public office. The senator had asked a sharp question, but Bondi had answered it with something far more powerful than a quick rebuttal. She had answered it with control, detail, and composure, and the room could feel the difference as the conversation continued. Pam Bondi did something that caught many observers off guard. Rather than becoming defensive or visibly frustrated, she shifted the focus of the discussion in a subtle but powerful way. The senator questioning her had spent several minutes outlining what he believed were questionable decisions made during her time in office. His argument relied heavily on reviewing events that had taken place years earlier and interpreting them through the lens of what is known today. Bondi listened carefully as the senator finished his remarks. She did not interrupt or rush to respond. When it was finally her turn to speak, she began calmly, acknowledging the senator's concerns, while also pointing out something that had not yet been addressed. Much of the criticism, she explained, depended on hindsight. Looking back at past decisions with the benefit of additional information can make those decisions appear clearer than they were at the time. But when those choices were originally made, the circumstances were very different. Bondi reminded the room that public officials are often required to make difficult legal judgments with limited information and under significant pressure. Investigations may still be ongoing, evidence may still be incomplete, and the legal standards that guide those decisions can be complex. In those moments, officials must rely on the facts available at that time, not on information that emerges. Years later, her tone remained steady as she continued. Bondi explained that the responsibilities of a state attorney general involve balancing many competing factors. There are legal standards that must be followed, but there are also practical considerations about how laws are enforced and how resources are used. Every decision, she said, is made within the boundaries of the law and the evidence that exists. In that specific moment, what may seem obvious, years later, often felt far less certain when those decisions were originally being made. Several people in the hearing room appeared to lean forward as she spoke. Reporters quietly typed notes while staff members sitting behind the lawmakers exchanged quick glances. Moments like this are common in high-profile hearings. The point where a witness moves from simply answering questions to explaining the broader reasoning behind their actions. Then Bondi added something that subtly changed the dynamic of the exchange. She pointed out that disagreements over legal decisions are not unusual. In fact, they are built into the structure of the American legal system. Lawmakers write laws. Attorneys interpret and enforce them. Courts review how those laws are applied. Because each of these institutions has a different role, disagreements about interpretation happen frequently. Bondi explained that this process is not a flaw in the system. It is part of how the system is designed to work. Legal debate, oversight hearings, and judicial review all exist to ensure that decisions can be questioned, examined, and debated. Hearings like the one taking place in that room, she said, are one of the ways democratic institutions hold officials accountable while also allowing them to explain the reasoning behind their choices. But Bondi also emphasized an important point. Criticism, she said, should reflect the full context of the decisions being discussed. Summaries that remove key details or compress complicated legal situations into a few sentences can create an incomplete picture. The reality behind most legal decisions is often far more complicated than it appears when viewed from a distance. Her explanation did not come across as combative. Instead, it sounded measured and deliberate, an attempt to clarify how those decisions had actually been made, rather than simply defending them. For a moment, the hearing room grew noticeably quiet. The senator who had begun the exchange glanced down at his notes, flipping through a few pages as if considering whether to continue the line of questioning. Camera operators remained fixed on the witness table, aware that moments like this often become the clips that circulate widely after a hearing ends. What had initially seemed like a difficult moment for Bondi had slowly transformed into something different. Instead of appearing cornered by the senator's argument, she had reframed the discussion by shifting the focus from individual decisions to the broader realities of legal decision-making. She redirected the conversation toward the complexities of the job itself. It was not a dramatic confrontation or a raised voice. exchange. The shift was quieter than that, but for many people, watching both inside the hearing room and outside of it, the change in tone was unmistakable. The discussion had started with an attempt to challenge her past actions. By the time Bondi finished speaking, it had become a conversation about how legal judgments are made and why they are often more complicated than they appear. And for many observers, that shift was impossible to miss. As the hearing moved forward, other lawmakers began asking their questions, and the atmosphere in the room slowly returned to a more routine pace. The tension that had filled the chamber earlier seemed to ease as the discussion shifted to other topics, and other members of the committee took their turns at the microphone. Yet, even as the hearing continued, it was clear that the earlier exchange had already left a lasting impression. The moment when a senator attempted to corner Pam Bondi had become the defining scene of the entire session. In the rows behind the lawmakers, reporters were already typing quickly on their laptops, summarizing what had just unfolded. Every sentence of the exchange was being captured and analyzed in real time. Some journalists leaned toward one another, quietly discussing the significance of the moment. Others hurried to send updates to their editors. Within minutes of the hearing ending, clips of the exchange began circulating online. Short video segments appeared on social media platforms, drawing attention from viewers who had not even been watching the hearing live. For many people following the story, that single moment quickly became the highlight. It was the part everyone wanted to watch. For supporters of Bondi, the exchange reinforced a reputation she had built over many years in public life. Throughout her career, she had developed a public image as someone who remained composed even when facing sharp criticism. Whether in courtrooms, press conferences, or legislative hearings, she was known for maintaining a steady tone and responding directly to accusations. That same approach had been visible during the hearing. When the questioning became more aggressive, Bondi did not appear flustered or defensive. Instead, she calmly addressed each point raised by the senator and explained the reasoning behind the decisions being discussed. Her answers were measured and deliberate. She avoided emotional reactions and focused instead on clarifying what she believed had been misunderstood. To many observers, that composure stood out. In political hearings, moments of confrontation can sometimes lead to heated arguments or defensive exchanges. But Bondi's response had taken a different path. Rather than simply rejecting the criticism, she challenged the assumptions behind the questions. She argued that the situation being described lacked important context and that decisions made during her time in office had been based on the legal responsibilities of her role. For viewers who supported her work, that explanation reinforced their belief that she had handled the situation effectively. However, not everyone interpreted the exchange the same way. For other observers, the moment highlighted something else entirely. It illustrated just how unpredictable congressional hearings can be. Even when lawmakers enter the room with carefully prepared questions and a clear strategy, the direction of a hearing can change quickly. A witness who is prepared and confident can shift the momentum of the conversation. In this case, what began as a line of questioning designed to challenge Bondi had evolved into something different. Instead of the senator controlling the narrative, the exchange turned into a back-and-forth discussion about the broader context of the decisions being examined. That shift surprised many people watching the hearing. Some political analysts later pointed out that hearings are not always the one-sided interrogations they sometimes appear to be. Witnesses often arrive well prepared. They study the issues, review potential questions, and think carefully about how to explain their actions. When those preparations meet an aggressive line of questioning, the result can be an unexpected exchange, like the one that unfolded during this hearing. Inside the hearing room, the conversation eventually moved on. Other lawmakers asked their questions, focusing on different topics related to the hearing's purpose. The earlier tension slowly faded as the committee continued its work. But even as the session approached its conclusion, it was clear that one moment had already captured the attention of everyone in the room. By the time the hearing ended, reporters were already preparing headlines about the confrontation. Political commentators began discussing the exchange on television and online. And viewers who watched the clips circulating on social media formed their own opinions about what had happened on the end. The senator's attempt to corner Pam Bondi had not unfolded the way many people expected. Instead of stumbling under pressure or offering a short defensive response, Bondi used the moment to explain her reasoning in detail. She pushed back against the narrative being presented and reframed the conversation around the responsibilities of her office. Whether people agreed with her or not, the exchange demonstrated how quickly the dynamic of a hearing can shift. A single question can trigger a moment that changes the tone of an entire session. and sometimes the person being questioned ends up shaping the story more than the person asking the questions. By the time the hearing concluded, and the room slowly began to empty, one thing was clear. The moment people would remember most was not the routine questioning that followed, it was the unexpected reversal earlier in the session, the moment when a senator tried to corner Pam Bondi, and the exchange took a turn that few had anticipated. Before you go, take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We post more stories about major courtroom moments and political hearings you won't want to miss.